Every legal system requires, at its foundation, a person willing to do what the law itself demands, but cannot perform. That person has existed in some form across nearly every organized society in recorded history, and nearly every one of those societies has found a way to make that person invisible. This documentary is not about violence. It is about design, specifically on the deliberate institutional design of distance. The question we are examining is this: when a state decides that a human life should end, how does it engineer the mechanics of that act so that no single human being feels fully responsible for what occurs? The executioner is the most visible node in that system, but the role was constructed over centuries specifically to absorb a burden the state could not carry publicly. Understanding how execution methods evolved, from direct blade contact to mechanical levers and trapdoors, reveals a sustained institutional effort to diffuse moral agency across mechanisms, procedures, and titles. In medieval Europe, execution was largely a public act. The executioner used a sword or an axe, so the physical and psychological proximity was total. The condemned, the executioner, and the crowd all occupied the same space. There was no mechanism intervening between the act and its author. What the state authorized, a specific human being performed with their body, at close range, in full view. This directness created a persistent social problem. Executioners in many European jurisdictions were legally and socially contaminated by their work. In parts of medieval Germany, they were prohibited from entering certain churches, from sitting with other tradesmen, from marrying into certain families. Their children inherited reduced social standing. The work was considered necessary, but the person performing it was considered marked. And this is important to understand. The contamination was not incidental. It was structural. The state needed the act performed, but it also needed the moral weight of that act to rest somewhere other than on the institution itself. The executioner served both functions simultaneously, as agent and as repository. And what changed over the following centuries was not the state's need for that repository. What changed was the design of the mechanism through which the act was performed, and how that design was justified. The guillotine is perhaps the most discussed example of this engineering process, but its logic is often misread. When the device was formally adopted in France in 1792, the stated rationale was egalitarianism, a single method applied equally across social classes, replacing a system where beheading by sword was reserved for nobility and hanging for commoners. But embedded in the egalitarian argument was a secondary claim that the machine removed the possibility of executioner error and therefore removed suffering. What that second claim actually accomplished was something more subtle. It relocated agency. When a blade falls along a guided track in response to a lever being released, who has performed the execution? The person who released the lever? The engineer who designed the guide rail? The assembly that passed the judgment? The law under which the judgment was rendered? And the mechanism distributes culpability across all of these simultaneously, and in doing so, concentrates it on none of them fully. This is the central architecture of what we might call execution engineering. The more steps between judgment and death, the more actors in the chain, the more mechanical the process, the more the act appears to belong to procedure rather than to any individual will. So the trapdoor gallows, which became the standard method in Britain and much of the British colonial world through the 19th and into the 20th century, represents a refinement of this principle. The condemned stands on a platform. A bolt is drawn. A trapdoor falls. The person drops. The physics of the drop, calculated by weight and measured drop length, are intended to cause near instantaneous loss of consciousness through cervical dislocation rather than strangulation. The executioner does not strike. the executioner releases a mechanical constraint. This distinction between striking and releasing was not merely procedural. It was psychologically significant to the people who performed these acts, and it was institutionally significant to the states that employed them. Releasing a lever is described in training manuals and official accounts in the passive register. The drop occurs. The mechanism operates. The condemned is hanged. The language itself is engineered to match the distance the mechanism created. Our recurring anchor in this analysis is the career of Albert Pierrepoint, who served as the principal hangman for England and Wales from 1932 until his resignation in 1956. Pierrepoint carried out the executions of a documented 435 individuals, a number that includes convicted murderers tried in Britain as well as war criminals executed following the Nuremberg trials. His career is unusually well documented for a role that governments have historically preferred to leave unexamined. What Pierrepoint's documented accounts reveal is not a man who experienced his work as a mechanical procedure emotionally. He was trained to work efficiently, to minimize duration, and to treat the condemned with, by his own account, a kind of professional neutrality. And the system was designed to feel procedural. But Pierrepoint's eventual resignation and the statements he made in his later years suggest that the procedural frame did not fully contain the psychological reality of the work. Whether his later views represent a reliable account of his experience or a retrospective reframing is something historians continue to assess. What they do not dispute is that the role cost him something. The question of how states manage the human cost of their most extreme operations is not a historical question only. The mechanisms change. The underlying problem, that institutions require people to do things institutions cannot be seen to own, has not.